Right, so my name is Eric Anderson, Professor of Masculinities, and I want to show you some data on changing masculinities today. I'm going to go fast now because of this. Okay, come on.
You can do 15. That might
All right. So I just want to highlight that clearly masculinity has biological components to it, but in terms of the social construction aspect of masculinities, the modern form of masculinity that we readily identify with today, and I won't fill you in with all the adjectives that describe that, really come from turn of the 20th century events. We're really looking at results of World War I. We're looking at results of industrialization. We're also looking at the results of a principal theorist that you may have heard of as psychologists. I'm not sure. The guy's name, of course, is Sigmund Freud. And what I want to highlight today, though, that masculinity is changing and shifting today in response to decreasing cultural homophobia, to decreasing antipathy towards homosexuality. Now, this is an incontrovertible finding across both disciplines of sociology and psychology, that attitudes towards gay men have changed dramatically in the last 3 decades. This is just this is pure Gallup. This is just one result showing improved attitudes towards gay marriage. In fact, in 1988, when the General Social Survey and the British Survey of Social Attitudes asked the question, it was at 10% of the population agreed that gays should be able to be married. And then, of course, at this one, it was 67. In America, it's now 72, 74%. This is an incredibly rapid improvement. In fact, longitudinal research on implicit bias also shows a 30% gain, and the trend lines for implicit bias suggest that in 8 years from now, and now it's just a suggestion, it won't actually materialize, but that in 8 years from now, there will be no more implicit bias towards gay men. This is a very rapid social movement. So what I want to introduce to you is the idea that we've been stable for quite a period of time now with youth. I've done a 10-year longitudinal study of team sport athletes from the day they arrive at university, measuring them using standardized instruments of homophobia. And you can see that the rates of homophobia are, this is just the last 5 years, are incredibly low, right? So they've gone from incredibly low to almost non-existent. And this is amongst rugby players and football players and so forth, 18-year-old heterosexual boys. So this has been a consistent finding. So what kind of impacts might this have on the construction of modern masculinities? I'm going to hit you up with the theory first. And the theory is this. On the x-axis, we have a number of socio-politically important events that occurred throughout the 20th century. And the one thing that these events have in common is raising the profile, the awareness that homosexuality exists within Anglo-American cultures. So you have, of course, Oscar Wilde's conviction in 1895, you have Kinsey's research, you have Stonewall, you have McCarthyism, and the biggest one here is HIV/AIDS of the 1980s. We could no longer deny that homosexuality existed, not just as an abstract psychological idea, but that somebody in this room, somebody in our church, on our team, or in our families could be gay. We readily believe, wrongly so, but we readily believe from Kinsey's work that it was about 10%. And we couldn't deny the existence because gay men were dying in our midst of HIV/AIDS, right? So what that did is it raised the cultural awareness of homosexuality's existence to 100%. It is fair to say that in the West today, we all know gay men exist. There's about 6 of us in this room or so today. So we know we exist, right? And I add that's a new aspect to homophobia studies. Because what we've looked at previously is just the curved line. Now, the top line is theoretical. I've created it. There's no empirical data to support the idea that the belief that homosexuality exists in our own family structures has improved in those particular percentage increments. But I think it's fair to say that by the 1990s we were there, right? The second one is longitudinal. Now that's an amalgamation of American data from the General Social Survey and the British Survey of Social Attitudes. This is a horrible instrument, but it's asked year in and year out. It has been for decades now. It's verified and all that sort of stuff, right? And so what we see here is that antipathy towards homosexuality has dropped dramatically since 1992, right? And that's not going to come as a surprise to any of you who are more than 25 years old. So the contribution I'd like to make to masculinity studies in this capacity is to present to you 3 cultural sets. The first cultural set is one I call homo erasure. Now, this is a culture in which antipathy towards homosexuality might be very, very high, but the willingness to believe that gays exist in our culture is very, very low, right? So this is the case across multiple Middle Eastern countries today, okay? And in a case like that, when you don't readily believe that gay people can exist in your midst, then there's no need to socially prove that you're not gay. This is a culture that is so homophobic, people don't come out of the closet, the social movement doesn't get going, and a gay identity in your country doesn't really develop, and certainly not the belief that your brother, somebody in your church could be gay. Right? The next phase, if I'm going backwards on this, the next phase is that of homohysteria. Now, this is a cultural set in which we have high antipathy towards homosexuality, but we also know that gays are in our midst. And this poses a particular problem for heterosexual men, more so for men than for women, and that is this. How does a heterosexual socially prove that they are heterosexual in a culture with high antipathy towards homosexuality? How do you do it? Right? I mean, I could stand up here in the mid-1980s and say I'm gay, and nobody would question that. And of course, today, in 2019, nobody would question that. But because the closet exists, heterosexual men can be in the closet. And so heterosexual men have to socially prove that they are not gay. And the way that they prove they are not gay is through misogyny, it's through homophobia, it's through the hypersexualization of women, and it's through the adoption of hyper-masculine traits of masculinity. The traits that came about at the turn of the 20th century, right? The stoicism, the aggressiveness, the risk-taking, and all of that. That is a culture in which men are afraid to be the one where the fingers point at and say, you're the most feminine in the group, you must be the fag. The next cultural state is that of what I call inclusivity. Now, this doesn't mean men's inclusivity towards race or class or religion or whatever. This is specifically to be what is inclusive that was once exclusive to the idea of masculinity, and that is male homosexuality. So when gay men are included, when they're accepted by heterosexual community, I call this a culture of inclusivity. This is a culture, as the graph clearly shows, with high awareness that homosexuality exists, but very low antipathy towards it. Essentially, this is now a culture where you heterosexual men don't have to socially signal your heterosexuality because nobody actually cares. And when nobody actually cares, then I hypothesize that men will come together, that they will begin to be more emotional, to disclose to each other, that they will be more physically intimate with each other, that they will engage in less risk-taking behaviors, they'll be more likely to seek out therapy if required, they'll be more likely to do all sorts of feminized things, including move away from masculinized sports and towards feminized sports, to work within feminized occupations and terrains. And that is what I have been proving over the last 15 years, that that is precisely what young men today are doing. Let me give you some of that data. We don't have time to go into my theories. You know, I sort of blew the doors off the British media when I used 145 participants to show that, I'm going to skip through this here. I'm just going to get through this really quick. Here's what I find, that in the United Kingdom, 89% of heterosexual male undergraduates have kissed another male on the lips. Now, that's not a sexual act. It's a homosocial act. It's an enhanced handshake. It's a way to show, usually when drunk, but not always, that you've made it into my fraternity of brotherhood, right? So I've done 11 universities across America and shown that the kiss is coming to the United States as well. This was actually several years ago now. I'm sure it's advanced. 40% of straight men had kissed another male on the cheek. There is no history of men kissing each other on the lips in this country or the United States. Right? And of course, I show this is also happening in Australia. Right, so kissing. I'm not going to give you the stats so I can go a little bit quicker here on cuddling. But young straight men today, particularly team sport athletes, are cuddling. They are lying in bed and holding each other. They are embracing each other. Now, given the average age of men in this room, this might be quite not believable to you. But it was exemplified in the TV show Skins a decade ago now, where the opening scene was opening up with the two lead characters cuddling in bed. In one of my research studies on team sport athletes, we examined 40 team sport athletes. 39 of them had spent the night cuddling with another male in bed. This is a phenomena that to youth isn't a phenomena. But to me, it's amazing, right? So, then we've got loving. And this particular form of loving comes in the form of the bromance. One of my PhD students has just completed his doctoral work on the bromance, and here's what he finds. That young straight men, 50% of them, say they are more comfortable emotionally relating to their fellow male than they are to their own girlfriends. He charts that the difference between a friendship and a bromance is this. Men always used to know that they had a friend when they did stuff together. When they played games, played sports, drank beer together, right? Women always knew that they had a friend when they disclosed secrets, when they were emotionally intimate. What my researcher has shown is that today, young straight men know that they have a friend when they do stuff together. They have a bromance when they share emotions and secrets. And they all had a bromance. These were team sport athletes. Right? And in the bromance, 50% of the young men said that they were more comfortable spending time and emotionality with their bromance than with their girlfriends. And here's what they said. Because if I get into a fight with my bromance, he forgives me 5 minutes later. And if I get into a fight with my girlfriend, she brings it up again 5 months later. They reported a greater ease of homosocial emotionality than they do in heterogeneous emotionality. As therapists, I think that might be important to know. Next, what I highlight is not new. At the turn of the 20th century, John Ibsen, a professor of American Studies in Cal State Fullerton, shows that young straight men were physically all over each other. He's got thousands of photos of young straight men being physically intimate with each other. George Washington wrote emotional letters of love to another general. Abraham Lincoln spent 7 years with Joshua Speed in the same bed together because they couldn't be thought gay. So my argument is actually a cross-cultural application. It's that in some countries, and I'm showing this, for example, in Tunisia, men have walked down the street holding hands together, but the youth in Tunisia are becoming aware that homosexuality exists, and they're not holding hands. Maybe in decades to come, they'll start to hold hands together. So this is a cross-cultural historical model to explain variance in masculinities across cultures. Now, let me show you some data to show you how profound this shift is in the identification of masculinity. What we have on the left here of a Likert scale is heterosexual male rugby and football players, and on the question of self-identification of masculine. And here's completely masculine over here. This would be almost completely masculine, and then in the middle is equally masculine and feminine, okay? So this one here is slightly more masculine than feminine. Surprise, surprise, when you look at this group, 151 people, 65 and older, surprise, surprise, you know, you can do the mean, median, and mode on that one. You're all going to be pretty darn completely masculine, right? Let's go to the next age cohort, 50 to 64 years old. Less extreme on the totally masculine, right? I mean, you can see the trend line. I don't need to point that out to you. Let's go to the next cohort. Now, are you ready for this? Let's look at 18-year-olds. These are team sport athletes. These are men who are invested in archaic 20th century brain traumatizing sports, and this is how they self-identify. None identifies completely masculine. The mean, median, and mode, I assume, are slightly more masculine than feminine. That is phenomenal. Now, what I find interesting about this is at the same time that men's violence is decreasing, at the same time that men's homophobia has decreased unbelievably, at the same time that young straight men are opening up with their emotional vulnerabilities to each other, saying I love you to their best friends, physically cuddling, kissing, and in otherwise having emotional, physical relationships with other men. At the same time that relationships between gay men and straight men can advance to the bromance. At the same time, we're seeing the loss of sexual orientation identities, as Gerolf Riegler and his PhD advisor, good friend of mine, just lost his name, show that the same trend you see here is happening with heterosexuality. Young men are running away from completely heterosexual. They're moving towards more complicated versions of sexual identities. At the same time all this is happening, the far left has come up with the trope of toxic masculinity. A trope that generalizes all men without regard to age, ability, or anything, age or race, or even sexual orientation, a toxicity. So at the same time that the culture is raising its ear towards men, men have never been better. And I find that quite paradoxical, as well as very upsetting. That graph shows that the same thing is happening with non-team sport athletes. It's just a bit more extreme than with team sport athletes. And I don't know whether I'm going forward or backwards in graph time now. I've gone backwards. I think I'm at the end of my presentation. John, did I hit 15 minutes? Because I didn't time it.
Pretty good, yeah.
All right. And just the last graph for you. This is decreasing participation in football to prove that these most macho sports, teenage males are increasingly running away from. Right? The upper graph, the upper line, shows cultural viewing of the Super Bowl. So we've never been more interested in the Super Bowl than we are today, right? In terms of the percentage of the population that watched the Super Bowl, we're up to 35%. But young men playing football in American high schools has dropped from about 17% down to about 13%. That's a pretty significant drop. Right, questions? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, I may not have time for questions, huh?